Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and this is my vermicomposting system, if you want to call it that. It's actually a number of different systems, a variety of different types of systems. And as you can see, I'm almost at capacity here. I mean, if you really want to think of it as being at capacity, then it is, because I've always wanted to kind of keep my number of bins in check and not succumb to the temptation of just creating more and more bins and expanding my worm population. I really wanted to try to tune my system to make it only as big as it needs to be to satisfy the composting needs um, that result from the amount of organic waste that stems from my home. And if you've watched my channel, then you also know that I also take care of the composting of a lot of stuff that my mom provides from her cooking. And she cooks a fair amount for the entire family, so there's always an ample supply of vegetable cuttings and fruit cuttings that she's always sending home with me to feed to the worms. So uh, I guess back to the capacity topic. I'm, as you can see, at my limit. I don't really have much room here, and part of that is due to the overall size of the frame that the Vermibag tote rests in. You know, the space that occupies could almost fit two bus bins, and while I guess technically speaking, you can see that I've also built the frame for the Vermibag Mini, which in itself spills out of the shelving system, and the shelving system has always been meant to be my limiting factor, to say that, you know, hey, you know, that should really be the maximum number of bins that you have, whatever it is that you could fit onto those shelves there. So to try to address that problem, it just so happens that I'm fortunate enough to be at the end of the life cycle of two of my bins over here. These bins that were launched off on May 3rd are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.5 months old, almost 5.5 months old, since it's mid-October now. And their age is somewhere between 23, 24 weeks old. In order to help drive the completion of these bins, it was exactly 35 days ago, which is 5 weeks ago, that I set these bins up into what's known as a horizontal migration, which means that I've been feeding them only on one edge of the container, trying to convince the worms to migrate out of the finished compost and into the feeding zones. And that's worked really well. Based on what we saw the last time we reloaded these feeding zones, these bins should, at this point, be basically ready to go. I'm here today to harvest these two bins, collect all the compost into one place, and get the worms into a new habitat. Probably reuse that bin right there, change the label to today's date, and get the worms into there, into a fresh setup. So let's get up onto the bench and get to work on this. Alrighty, so we're going to begin with the smaller of the two bins. Because what I want to do is I want to basically leave the compost behind in this smaller container. And then when it comes time to do the other bin, I want to take the compost out of that and add it to this container, so that this container will temporarily hold all of the finished vermicompost from these two bins. And that's mainly because the buckets that I usually use to store my finished vermicompost are both at capacity as well. So I need to just use this container right here as a temporary holding ground for all of the finished vermicompost. So the first step here is going to just extraction of the worms from here. And for that purpose, I've got this temporary holding ground for them in this bucket here. And then we'll have a chance to empty the other container, also extracting the worms and then dumping the compost from that other container into here. We're gonna move this aside just enough so that we can actually bring in this other container here that we're going to be placing the worms into. And it's kind of nice that there's just enough overlap here so that if I spill anything, it should just drop right into here. That's a little convenient happenstance. So really not much to it. It's just a matter of scooping these little guys out, getting them in here, and then doing the same to the next bin. All right, so why don't we just begin? We're going to be, just picking out this entire feeding zone. So let's see how we did. Fair number of worms, fair amount of compost as well. Same thing here, pretty good number of worms hanging out. So I'm going to try to scrape into this edge here a little bit. Not much left to go here. Seems like every handful does have a fair number of worms in it. This might be a hunk of the food that they were given last time. Yep, that's what it looks like. They got mushrooms, and you can tell that this is a mushroom. And I'm glad to say that the stench that the mushrooms had when they were originally placed into this bin has dissipated, which I'm very thankful for, because when the mushrooms were placed in here originally, they really reeked. They stunk up to high heaven, which might have been a good contributing factor to lure the worms over out of the finished compost. But I guess what we're dealing with here now in the bin is what should theoretically be more or less finished compost, depopulated of worms. And it's part of the reason I'm kind of scraping into the finished compost a bit to try to see if I can grab any more concentrations of worms, but do it in a way that I don't really end up scooping out too much of the finished compost. So I guess part of what goes along with this is also coming to the understanding that the finished compost could potentially still have occupants. And in most cases, if all you're going to be doing is using this material out in your garden, then that's just a good thing, because the occupants of your compost will do wonders for your soil out in your garden. So you don't have to go crazy worrying about depopulating your compost. But, I guess if there's any chance to keep your worms in your composting population as opposed to releasing them into the wild, then might as well take those opportunities. And that's kind of what I'm doing here, is trying to pick through a little bit and see if I could salvage one or two of my little workers here to keep them in my colony as opposed to releasing them. But I'm really not going to go crazy worrying about that either, If there's worms that remain in my compost, then guess what? Their new job is going to be to make my garden healthy. So their original job in here was to help break down organic waste, and their new job is going to be to continue doing that, but out in the garden. And at the same time aerating my soil and doing all the good stuff that they do out in the garden. So I guess with that in mind, you kind of come to you come to sort of an ease in your mind about releasing a bunch of your composting worms. But it also kind of means that you have to recognize that, horizontal migration, I guess in a small space like this, has its limits, in terms of being able to accomplish a full depopulation of the material. Because it's just only so big, there's only so many places for the worms to wander into. So as much as you want to try to make the feeding zone as tempting and as alluring to them as possible, I guess there might always still be enough of a enticement within the old material to keep them over there. As we saw here, you know, unless obviously you've got vermicompost that's been entirely 100% depleted of anything nourishing, at which point the worms would definitely need to go in search of some food to eat. But yeah, this bin, I guess, just has not been around that long that the material would be fully you know, depleted of any nourishing material, which is good, you know, because then the worms can still hang out in that and not starve. So that's good that there's still some organic matter remaining in that for them to continue working on. So, all right, the only other thing to do is to do the same treatment to the other bin to get the worms out of there, and then we'll go ahead and we'll transfer the vermicompost from that container into here as well. That'll free up that other bin, the larger of the two bins, to give these guys a place to be so we could set up a new habitat for them. So let's get that other bin out here. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's get to work. Let's get these little guys moved over. I wonder if I can do a little segmentation right here from the very beginning to delineate what gets removed and what remains. And that'll kind of force me to not get hung up on trying to extract more worms after I've done the removal of the feeding zone and the worms that are in it. If it's possible just to settle into the fact that, hey, having worms in your compost is okay, then it's a little bit easier, a little bit of an easier pill to swallow, as opposed to thinking that you've got to come up with some sort of perfect vermicompost that's completely free of worms. Let's see if I could spot any more mushrooms in here. This bin would have been fed with the same stuff as the other bin, primarily rotted mushrooms from the refrigerator. See a fair amount of bedding, but and then a whole bunch of worms. This looks like maybe more of a banana stem. Looks like our new bin is going to have a good number of worms in it. And it is kind of an interesting crossroads, you know. At this point, I definitely have different opportunities in front of me. You know, I can certainly follow through with the original plan of harvesting the compost out of those two bins, you know, out of this bin and the other bin. But I'm still at the point where if I wanted to, I could just rebuild this feeding zone once again and try to continue encouraging the worms that are still within the compost to exit and make their way over into the feeding zone. And I could probably just continue on and on until such a time that the worms have really completely exited the vermicompost. And I'm sure that's possible. I've seen it done. And you know, to that point, if you were to work your way further into the compost, the opposite side of where the feeding zone is, you will ultimately see that the material is very much free of worms. It's only because we're right here on the edge that we're seeing a fair number of worms within the material. But that obviously tapers off as you get further away from where the food source was. Because if you saw a couple of my other videos when we last worked in these bins, you will know that we already knew at that time that the material was, for the most part, depopulated. Okay, so what we have here is a pretty good, healthy number of worms, quite a large number of worms, that we're going to use to launch off this bin again after we rebuild it. But before we can do that, we've got to clear out all this compost. So let's get the worms out of our way. And we're just going to bring back the other container here that we took the worms from previously. And at this point, we can work on getting the finished vermicompost all into this bin for storage, at least for temporary storage. And I guess the easiest way to do that might be to simply pour it over. But it is a lot of material, so I'm just worried about spilling it. Maybe it is best that I kind of spin it around this way and scoop it over rather than trying to spill it over, because in the end I'll probably end up regretting it. And then this way we can have a little bit more of a hands-on approach of actually pulling out the material that's right on the edge first, so we can see how many worms are actually still cruising around in it. It's not too bad, not too many. Material's really nice, really beautiful stuff. And it does look like we did manage to get a fair number of the worms out of this. Oh, here we go. Here and there, I guess you're just going to come across a larger jumble of worms, and I'm just not going to sweat it. I'm not going to worry about it. It's not really the objective here. I guess if you can, in your mind, set your expectations correctly and not expect that this is going to be entirely worm-free compost, then finding worms within your finished compost and coming to the realization that they're simply going to start performing a different function elsewhere, specifically working the material or working the dirt out in your garden, or working the earth in your garden, then it becomes less of a, I don't know what's the right word for it, becomes less of a burden on your mind, I guess. You don't start thinking about it in terms of it being a failed horizontal migration or a failed depopulation of your finished compost. It just becomes par for the course and a completely normal outcome, and then you become a little bit more calm with what you're encountering and seeing. And here and there, you find little bits and pieces of food scattered throughout the material, which is a good explanation as to why they've not all left yet, because the material has not been entirely broken down. So the presence of some organic material within the compost is good as well. It provides all of the living organisms, not only the worms, but all the bacteria and everything else, with an ongoing source of nourishment. Definitely seeing fewer worms as we make our way away from where the feeding zone had been previously and over to the opposite edge of the container. And the material is also a little bit drier, a little bit more crumbly, because there's not been any food introduced into this other edge for quite a while, 35 days to be precise, since we moved over to feeding on the edge only. Oops. Getting sloppy here, dropping a little bit here and there. This is kind of interesting to actually go through one handful at a time to be able to inspect all of the more or less finished compost to see exactly how it looks every step of the way, and to also be able to observe how there's fewer and fewer worms within it as you distance yourself from where the feeding zone had been. guess we're down to the point where there's only so much left, so I think that just spilling it over might be the easiest way to get the last of it, but I'm going to see what I could do about scooping some of the material out of these crevices and features and little ribs within the bottom of my bin here. Okay, so I think we're down to the point where we can simply spill out what remains in this container. All right. Okay, so here we have it. It's a full bus box. It's got some good weight to it, that's for sure. Got ourselves a nice full bus box full of vermicompost. And normally, as you've seen in my previous videos, if you watched any of my videos in the past, normally I'll keep this stuff in a bucket, but my 2 buckets are at capacity now. So I'm just going to keep it in this bin temporarily. So I don't have to do anything too fancy with it. I'll simply cover it up with a piece of newspaper and try to not let it dry out too much. Although it does have a fairly high moisture content, so I believe allowing it to dry off a little bit is not the end of the world either. I'm just trying to level it off a little bit here so that the paper can rest on it evenly. Alright, I believe this is the piece of paper that was actually resting on top of the material in this container previously, so it's already the right size and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this aside, and I'm also going to give that other bigger container a quick rinse so that we can rebuild it quickly to get it ready for placing the worms into it. Okay, so I took a piece of fairly dingy piece of cardboard I had laying around here, as well as some of this newspaper that was covering up the feeding zones in those 2 bins that we just emptied. Just trying to create some bedding over here, and I'll also include some shredded newspaper as well as some dry leaves to make this into a really comfortable bedding for them. So this is just kind of a workspace I've set aside. Here's the actual bin that we're going to be placing the worms into. Nice and clean. It's the bin that we actually just got finished working on, removing the worms and compost from. I took it outside to give it a little bit of a rinse, so you can see it's still a bit damp. And a lot of people will say, hey, why do you clean it off? There's all kinds of good beneficial microbes and organisms and stuff living in that stuff that you treat as dirt on the sides. Well, you know, guess what? The material that the worms are presently in, as you can see, is chock full of that good stuff. So I like to start with a nice clean bin. So, you know, that's just me. Everyone can do it the way they like. It's certainly not necessary. But now we can start rebuilding this container from scratch to give these worms a nice new home. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've added a little bit of water to get all of this cardboard and newspaper nice and damp before we add it to the bin as bedding. And I use the water out of my tap, but before using it I let it sit for a while in a watering can, only because I've got water in this area that's very chlorine-y, you know, so I'm sure it probably wouldn't do the worms much harm to just give them straight tap water out of my faucet, but I just prefer to give the water a chance, you know, to sort of clear out of all the chlorine that's in the water. And that only takes a day or two. The chlorine will actually evaporate out of the water, so that the water that I'm using for this is relatively chlorine free, or at least I hope so. Water's been sitting in that watering can for some time now. I think I've managed to sop up the majority of the water from this little bath into the cardboard. The cardboard and newspaper all have a pretty good dampness to them now. So let's go ahead and drop that in. Okay. And I just like to kind of crumble it all up a little bit so it's not all matted down and laying flat. Try to spread it out pretty evenly throughout the bottom of the container. Try to separate pieces that have come stuck to each other. Okay. So now on top of this, I wanted to add some other bedding materials. So I've got a fair amount of shredded up newsprint here. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of that around on the bottom as well. This stuff I didn't dampen ahead of time, but it should pick up moisture from the wet cardboard that's beneath it, as well as the more damp materials that are going to be placed on top of it. The materials that the worms are presently in. Liberty Science Center. I don't think this is paper. We'll just get this out of here. It's probably plastic. I took my niece to the Liberty Science Center, and that was a sticker that they were handing us out to show that we'd been paid to get in. All right, so we got a nice little layer of bedding here, but it's not quite done. I'm also going to add some leaves to this. Okay. Also somewhat dry stuff, but luckily the paper underneath is fairly damp, so it should hopefully share some of its moisture. I also wanted to include a little bit of food for them, and for that I bought nothing too fancy this go around, just some used coffee grinds. I remember that coming up in one of the comments about how that should be pronounced in someone else's video, but now I keep getting confused on how to say it. Coffee grounds, I believe, right? The coffee grounds I'm going to be plopping in here as their food source to start with, but I'm also going to go on the assumption that a fair amount of the food that they were given when I set the horizontal migration feeding zone up for them is still there, because you might remember in the beginning we found what appeared to be almost an entire mushroom intact still, so I'm going to assume that that's not the only one. I'm going to assume that there's still a fair amount of food commingled in the material that the worms were extracted with. So I don't want to give them a glut of food. I figured I'd, give them some easy to eat stuff, so the coffee grounds are the perfect solution to that. So these eggshells, these are ground up eggshells, should help also by incorporating it into their food supply. If they're in the need for any grit, and that's the main purpose of putting this in here, the grit should help them eat their food. So it's a nice generous supply of grit to help with their digestion. So I'm just sprinkling it all over the place. Should make them pretty happy. So in the end we're going to put some more leaves on top, but it's time to put the worms in. Let's go ahead and drop them in. So here again, I'm not going to do anything fancy, no fanfare. I'm really just going to invert this tub and plop them in. And then we'll get a chance to check them out as they scatter. Looks like we got the majority of them. I don't think there's any stragglers left in this container. I'll double check later just to make sure we didn't leave anyone behind. So now I'm going to spread this stuff out. This will give us a chance to check out the worms. Here's a mushroom. Definitely verifying that there's still some food scraps in here from the previous feeding, which was another thing I wanted to do. Got a good number of worms. We also introduced a fair amount of additional bedding that was part of their feeding zone too. A variety of scraps of cardboard and leaf matter. So I think we're off to a nice start with this bin. Pretty good sized population. A nice rich carbon-based bedding with some food scraps added and grit added, in addition to the food that they're being introduced with anyway. There's also a nice comfortable layer for them to hang out in before they want to try to roam and explore and get acclimated to the new space underneath. So I think that's a nice thing too. It's not going to give them that sort of shock of being in an entirely new space. They're still kind of in their element. They're still in the medium or the material that they had been in for a while now. Alright, so I gave these little guys a little bit of time to kind of work their way down into the material and escape from the overhead light. I believe they've done a good job of it because I don't see any of them at this point. So maybe one more time before we cover them up, we'll just do a little bit of a probing around just to check out this stuff a little bit more before we put the thing back up on the shelf. Trying to figure out what this is here. This looks like it may have been maybe some sort of a melon or something. It's a very, very thin skin of whatever it was that they received for food previously. I was just curious to see if I could find any more of those intact mushrooms. There's a fair amount of finished compost here as well that they can hang out in until they feel like venturing out of it. Pretty much anywhere we poke around at this point, not too far beneath the surface, we're finding nice size population of worms. No one concentration of them anywhere. Because I mean, granted, they were just plucked out of their previous environment. And they were placed into that temporary container for a little while. And now they've been dumped out. So now they're still getting disturbed by me poking around here. Sorry guys, I just can never resist checking them out. But I just wanted to kind of get a sense of how many worms are in here, and it seems like we've got a fair number of them. So let's not keep bothering these little guys. Let's give them some peace and a chance to chill out and relax. I'll go ahead and I'm going to cover up here with some leaves, which is what I like to generally use as my my primary cover, since I've got such a large number of them outside in my leaf bags from whenever I collect leaves in the autumn. And usually the leaves that I'm using from my box here are taken from a box or taken from a bag of leaves outside that are actually a couple years old at this point. So these have had a lot of time to dry out and whatnot. So, all right. I don't think it's necessary to go overboard in covering this up, except for the fact that the material that they came over in is sort of a commingling of not only the vermicompost that they're in, but, you know, as we saw, a fair amount of scraps of food that they were consuming most recently. And it's because of that that I want to just make sure that none of that food is really exposed to the air where it could potentially attract flying insects. So it's not a lot of leaf cover, but it is enough to make sure that it's providing a complete adequate cover over the entire top surface. All right, so I think that's it. We've got ourselves a new bin. I've got a label to stick on it. October 14th, that's today's day. And I've also got a couple labels over here for my African and my European night crawlers. The Vermibags don't have labels on them, so I'm going to make sure I label them as well. And then other than that, the only other stuff to be done down here is a little bit of cleanup. Clean up these bins that are soiled from having done the work, but that's no fun. I'm not going to keep you around for that. I'm going to go ahead and call it a day with this. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate your company. And if you enjoyed this video, then, you know, I always really appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to give me a thumbs up and show that you like the video. Leave a comment down in the comment section if you have any questions or just want to say something. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always really appreciated as well and always helps. So thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.